I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Oxford Brookes University. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to this year's Annual Gaza Lecture, which is entitled Gaza, When is Life Grievable? Some Personal Reflections on Decades of Research in Palestine. And the lecture this evening is being delivered by Sara Roy. And Sara, welcome to Oxford Brookes. We're delighted to have you here. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping before we start. First and foremost, we're not expecting any fire alarms tonight, so if the fire alarms do go off, please exit the building in an orderly fashion, either through the doors at the rear or to the side, and congregate in the plaza outside. And can I politely ask you, please, to make sure that your mobile phones are switched off or on silent. Thank you very much. I just want to say a few words about the scholarship, the Gaza Scholarship. The Annual Gaza Lecture is an opportunity for us to celebrate the Oxford Brookes Gaza Scholarship. And this annual scholarship supports a Gaza student in completing a master's degree at Oxford Brookes University. And since the Oxford Brookes Gaza Scholarship was first established in 2010, our scholars have gone on to make significant impacts in a wide range of fields, including environmental sustainability, journalism, refugee support, cancer treatment, and digital technology. And all of them have helped to promote Palestinian culture here at Oxford Brookes and further afield. And they've carried the message of how much the people of Gaza have to offer the world. As I'm sure you're all aware, life in Gaza is often precarious. The local economy is stifled by the blockade, and for many ambitious young Gazans, there are very few local opportunities to progress. Higher education beyond bachelor's level is not available, so scholarships such as ours, offering a chance to study for a master's, are a practical way of supporting talented Gazans to make their mark on the world. And we are tremendously proud of all of our scholars and what they have achieved. As students, they have enriched our university community, and as graduates, they've made lasting impacts in Gaza, the UK, and globally. And we are determined to help many more Gazan students do the same in the future. The Oxford Brookes Gaza Scholarship is funded through the generosity of individual donors. And if any of you are interested in supporting the scholarship or in finding out more about it, then please do go to our website for further details. And a link will also be shared via email after today's event. I'd now like to introduce you to our 2020 scholar. Khaya Abdelhadi graduated in 2020 with an MA in Development and Emergency Practice, and she is now a Gender Justice Officer with Oxfam in Palestine. She can't unfortunately be with us here tonight, but she has kindly sent us a few words on video to share with us what the scholarship means to her.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening from Gaza. Allow me first to introduce myself. My name is Haya Abdelhadi. I'm from Gaza, Palestine. I was thrilled and honored to be awarded the Gaza Scholarship in 2019. All what I can say about it is that it was an insightful experience in all means. I studied a master's degree in development and emergency practice, and I did sub-specialization in conflict and the humanitarian action, a topic that is really needed in light of the protracted crisis in Palestine and the volatile context of Gaza. Having the opportunity to study in Oxford was beyond perfection. I met and interacted with different students and professors from across the globe, and we shared one passion, which is defending human rights. Surely, Gaza had been at the heart of all my discussions. I wanted to be the voice of the voiceless, conveying testimonies and stories that maintain the history of Palestine and reflect not only the human suffering and Palestinians' continuous struggle to strive and live in dignity, but also their resilience and their attachment to their land. After finishing my studies in the UK, it was not the end of the journey. It was actually the beginning. 2 months after I returned back to Gaza, I joined the Emergency Task Force and worked as project supervisor with a humanitarian organization where we provided emergency relief to marginalized communities. It was the right time to apply what I learned to better support my community. Now I'm working with Oxfam, which actually comes from the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief, established in the UK in 1942. So you can say I have Oxford close to my heart wherever I go. I'm working on a global program supporting women and girls. All what I just want to say that I'm really proud of this experience, and I'm really grateful for all the great support and kindness I received from the university, my friends, and the scholarship supporters, including for sure Sir Ian and his wonderful wife, Jan. So thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, with the continued support to funding this scholarship, you do greatly help making Palestinian students' dreams come true. We do have competencies and we do have the potential to succeed above and beyond, only if we were given the opportunity. We do love our homeland, Palestine, and we love to make the world a better, safe place for everyone. I wish I could have joined you tonight, but I wish you a wonderful evening, and thank you.
Hear from Chaya, and so wonderful to always wonderful to know about the great things our students go out and do in the world, but I think that was particularly fantastic to hear, so that's wonderful. But now I'd like to introduce you to our speaker and tell you a little bit more about our speaker this evening. Dr. Sara Roy is a senior research scholar at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. She specialises in the Palestinian economy, Palestinian Islamism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Sara began her research in the Gaza Strip and West Bank in 1985 with a focus on the economic, social, and political development of the Gaza Strip and on US foreign assistance to the region. Since then, she has written extensively on the Palestinian economy, particularly in Gaza, and on Gaza's de-development, a concept that she originated. Sara's book, Hamas and Civil Society in Gaza, Engaging the Islamist Social Sector, won a British Kuwait Friendship Society Book Prize and was named one of Choice's outstanding academic titles in 2012. Her most recent book, Unsilencing Gaza, Reflections on Resistance, was published in 2021. Sara has also authored over 100 publications dealing with Palestinian issues and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and she's lectured widely in the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and Australia. In addition to her academic work, she serves on the International Advisory Council of American Near East Refugee Aid, and she has served as a consultant to international organizations, the US government, human rights organizations, private voluntary organizations, and private business groups working in the Middle East. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Sara to the stage to talk to us tonight. Thank you, Sara.
Well, thank you all for being here. I want to begin first by thanking Oxford Brookes University and the conveners of the Annual Gaza Lecture, particularly Sir Ian Chalmers, Dean Lucy Masden, and Laura Donna Farone for her invaluable support and assistance. And I am absolutely delighted and honored to be here, and to be here in person for the first time in 2 or 3 years, I think. In thinking about this talk, I decided that I did not want to focus strictly on the grave conditions inside Gaza, which I assume many of you are aware of. Rather, I want to talk on what I have learned in my near 4 decades of researching Gaza by addressing some of the most consistent and prominent themes in my research that have been not only consistent, but unrelenting throughout nearly 4 decades of work. I'd like to begin with a story, one I've written about before, but it bears retelling. It was the summer of 1985 during my very first visit to Gaza. I was taken on a tour of the area by a woman who had become a dear friend of mine named Alia. As we drove along Gaza's coastal road, I saw an elderly Palestinian man standing on the shoreline with some boxes or crates of oranges next to him. I was puzzled by this, and I asked Alia to stop the car. One by one, the elderly Palestinian man took an orange and threw it into the sea. His was not an action of playfulness, but of pain and regret, as if the weight of each orange was more than he could bear. Not understanding what I was seeing, I asked Alia why he was doing this, and she explained that he had been prevented from exporting his oranges into Israel as he had in previous years, and rather than watch them rot in his orchard, he decided to cast them into the sea. I've never forgotten this scene so long ago and the impact that it had on me. Nearly 40 years later, after peace agreements, economic protocols, roadmaps, so-called disengagements, donor conferences, reconciliation attempts, airports and seaports, Gazans are still casting their oranges into the sea. Yet Gaza is no longer where I found it so long ago, but someplace far worse. Gaza's trajectory over the last 55 years has taken it from a politically and economically integrated territory to an isolated enclave, from a functional economy to a dysfunctional one, from a productive society to an impoverished one, and from a people with nationalist claims to a humanitarian problem, where most men, women, and children in Gaza require some form of humanitarian assistance or relief to sustain themselves. These damaging transformations, among others, have become formalized and permanent, shaping a future that is both partial and disfigured. What is happening to Gaza is catastrophic. It is also deliberate, conscious, and planned. In my early research, I was primarily concerned with the occupation and its economic impact on the Gaza Strip because it was the economy that so starkly and unsparingly illustrated the profound inequities that form the structural and philosophical core of occupation policy. My initial focus on the economy stemmed from the profound shock and confusion I felt when I first lived in Gaza over 35 years ago. The chasm between what I had been taught and what I encountered in Israel's treatment of the Palestinians stunned me. As an American Jew and child of Holocaust survivors, growing up in the 1960s and 70s and educated in elite schools, I was told, often implicitly, to believe and never question Israeli beneficence and morality and Arab incompetence and incivility. Although my parents taught me to think critically and often provided much needed counterpoints, the intellectual weight of the time, the political weight of the time, was difficult to cast aside. There was little, if any, context for speaking critically about Israel or sympathetically or ethically about Arabs, who were forbidden, as we were, to use the word Palestine or Palestinian. Although I had visited Israel many times during my childhood, my first trip to the West Bank and Gaza occurred, as I said, in the summer of 1985. I traveled there against the protestations of the Israeli part of my family to conduct fieldwork for my doctoral dissertation, which examined an American program of bilateral economic assistance to the Palestinians. My thesis asked whether economic development was possible under conditions of military occupation. And my search for an answer immersed me in a world I was wholly unprepared for. As a well-trained graduate student, I felt I had a certain understanding of the political complexities of the area, the actors involved, their histories, and the many arguments and sides of the conflict. I went, I believed, with a critical but open mind. I went, I believed, prepared for anything. I was wrong. Those first few months in Gaza and the West Bank changed my life. I distinctly remember the day I first entered Gaza. I had been in the West Bank for some time, and I had acquired some familiarity with the people and the region and felt comfortable living there, despite the harshness of the occupation. However, the thought of living in the Gaza Strip made me nervous, even scared. I had heard terrible and frightening stories about Gaza and its people, especially from my Israeli friends and family. I was taken to the Marna House, which was then one of only 2 hotels in the Gaza Strip, and it was managed by Alia Shawa, who belonged to one of Gaza's oldest and wealthiest families, and who, as I said earlier, would become one of my dearest friends. Alia welcomed me, but clearly viewed me with some suspicion. After all, why would an American be visiting Gaza? And when she learned I was Jewish, her concern and my anxiety grew. In those days, prior to the first Palestinian uprising, which began in December of 1987, one of the first questions I was often asked by Gazans was, "Are you a Christian?" I never lied and told everyone who asked that I was Jewish. To my surprise, it was not fear or anger that I typically encountered, but shock, suspicion, and above all, curiosity. I took advantage of their curiosity and my somewhat unique status to begin a discussion of why I was there, explaining that I had come to Gaza to learn about its economy, its people, its society, and the military occupation and its impact on life inside Gaza. I thought it would take me a long time to gain their trust, but again, I was wrong. Within 1 week of arriving in Gaza, I was immersed in local life in a manner I could not possibly have foreseen, taken from one end of the strip to the other by people I barely knew, but whom Alia initially vetted. I entered areas seldom, if ever, seen by foreigners, helped by people whose support and encouragement would have been unthinkable to me, unimaginable to me, just days before. Many of those same people would later risk their lives to help me collect data during the first Intifada for my book on the political economy of de-development. I was invited into homes, both rich and poor, where no request was too great or question too burdensome. Not only did my being Jewish cease to be a source of concern, it actually became an asset. People could not do enough to help me. Although I could not possibly have known it at the time, that summer of 1985 set the stage for the next decades of my life. The injustice of the occupation and the inability of Palestinians to defend themselves against it affected me deeply. My research among them was not only a matter of scholarship, it went to the core of who I was, where I came from, the meaning of my Judaism, my identity as a child of Holocaust survivors, my relationship with Israel, and the nature and purpose of my work. One of the most striking aspects of the occupation during my early encounter with it was its prosaic nature. For Palestinians, occupation was the ordinary, a way of life that had to be lived defensively without recourse or appeal. Furthermore, the distortion of Palestinian life remained unquestioned for those who weren't aware of it. And for whom the realities of occupation were wholly unknown. What was for Palestinians a narrative of crisis, of territorial dispossession and displacement, was for others an example of benign and legitimate control. And it was the absence of this context and its continued mystification that my research has always sought to redress. As I've said many times before, my most powerful experiences in Gaza, the most poignant memories I have, are not of violence or despair, but of kindness and generosity, creativity and determination, the qualities that drew me to the people of Gaza from the very beginning. Society in Gaza has long struggled to remain whole and humane, despite the immense and largely unabated pressures imposed upon it, pressures which in the last 16 years have assumed new dimensions of cruelty, which have impoverished and imprisoned Gaza's people, denying them human rights and the possibility and dignity associated with those rights. In other lectures and writings, I have examined in detail some key paradigm shifts in the way the conflict and Palestinians are perceived and treated. Here, I will briefly highlight just 4 of these shifts because they have had a damaging and defining impact on Gaza and provide a critical framework within which to examine and understand some of the themes that I shall subsequently discuss. Now, the larger defining framework for these paradigm shifts is the Oslo process, which reduced the Palestinian struggle from a national movement to one focused solely on the West Bank and Gaza and on a state-building process. And perhaps most important is the absence in the Oslo Agreement of any mention of Palestinian rights, freedom of movement, freedom of residence, religion, family unification, and this also includes the inalienable right to self-determination, return, and to Jerusalem, part of Jerusalem, as their capital. Given this transformed and highly reduced framework, the first paradigm shift I want to discuss concerns the belief that occupation is reversible and should be reversed, which was largely unquestioned and uncontested and was once the catalyzing force behind many social, political, and economic initiatives. This belief that the occupation and the forces that sustain it can and should be stopped was long ago upended, and is powerfully illustrated in the formalization and acceptance by Israel and key members of the international community of Palestinian territorial and demographic fragmentation and isolation. Within this framework, established by Oslo, Gaza and the West Bank were separated demographically and geographically. And as a result, a largely isolated Gaza came to be seen as exceptional or marginal, existing outside a Palestinian state and outside a Palestinian nation. The many restrictive measures imposed on Gaza, notably the blockade, which has immiserated Gazan society, was designed to ensure the division and separation of the two territories. In this way, Gaza remains removed from any future political equation or resolution, ensuring that no viable Palestinian state or political construct can emerge. Benjamin Netanyahu, among other Israeli officials, have stated this very bluntly and very directly. The policies that have come to define Gaza as exceptional are simply extensions, albeit more extreme, of policies long used to separate and isolate Palestinians in the West Bank and in Israel. In this regard, Gaza's status is part of a long and consistent policy continuum of containment and removal. As such, Gaza became the model for the fragmentation of the West Bank into small, disconnected enclaves under constant assault. Hence, it is important to understand that these policies of separation and exclusion make it difficult, if not impossible, for Palestinians to imagine a larger sense of a collective. And without that sense, exclusion becomes the defining basis for politics and policy. In fact, given the years of separation and division of Gaza and the West Bank and the consistent failure to achieve a reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, let alone an end to the occupation, a local analyst writes that there is a growing concern and feeling among some segments of Palestinian society that the Gaza Strip must seriously consider finding exits from the humanitarian crisis that include an independent Gaza entity. Hamas also sees the division as a way of stabilizing and maintaining its control over Gaza, and as some analysts have argued, as a springboard for extending its control into the West Bank. In this way, Hamas is fighting against its own confinement to Gaza, or of limiting its identity as a resistance movement to Gaza alone. And in this, it has been somewhat successful. An article that appeared in the website Mondoweiss on October 17th stated the following, quote, just as the Israeli military is not confined to geography, neither is Palestinian confrontation. This August witnessed a new dynamic between Gaza and the West Bank, where unlike the past decade, Gaza became a mediating force for de-escalating resistance in the West Bank. Furthermore, I was told by trusted colleagues that it was not Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank that helped mediate the ceasefire in August of this year, but the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. Israel has long pursued the division of the West Bank and Gaza as a way to manage the occupation rather than end it. This is one reason Israel continues to impose the blockade and why it allows humanitarian assistance and monies into Gaza. Critically, the occupation has long remained unchallenged by an international order, largely Western order, and in the absence of meaningful legal and political pressure from the West, especially from the US and the EU, the presence of the Israeli army on Palestinian territory and military assaults against Palestinians, especially in Gaza, remain unopposed. This points to a second paradigm shift. Prior to Oslo, there was a belief among many Israelis and within the international community generally that peace and occupation were incompatible. The former, peace, could not be achieved in the presence of the latter, occupation. This too has changed. Peace and occupation are now considered quite compatible, in effect complementary, as seen most recently in the Abraham Accords, the so-called peace agreements between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, and in an expanding settlement enterprise, which is now considered vital to the protection and security of Israelis. Given that most Israelis have been shielded from the consequences of maintaining an indefinite occupation, and that the occupation has all but disappeared from Israeli discourse, the occupation has become an unquestioned, if not necessary, component of peace. Hence, Palestine's effective dismemberment and the permanence of territorial fragmentation are accepted not only by Israel, but also by key members of the international community as benign and totally manageable. The reality to which the international community has largely acceded is further characterized by a willingness to legitimize Israel's occupation in the so-called pursuit of peace, as long as there's no accepted agreement to end it. A more recent expression of Israel's attempt to isolate Palestinians and its largely unchallenged acceptance by the international community is a decision by the Israeli government to severely restrict the ability of foreigners to enter the West Bank for a variety of purposes, including education, business, humanitarian work, and family visits. The latter include foreign spouses of Palestinians and Palestinians with foreign passports. Not only does this make it harder for Palestinians to live as a family and make it harder for others to visit, it has a clearly intended effect of further isolating Palestinian society. In this way, the occupation was long ago transformed from a political and legal issue with international legitimacy into a simple dispute over borders, where the rules of war apply rather than those of occupation. And this is the third paradigm shift. This recasting from occupation to war was acutely clear and defining in Israel's relationship with Gaza, and was made easier after Hamas's 2006 election victory and 2007 takeover of the Gaza Strip. A recasting the international community has largely come to accept, if not embrace. Henceforth, Gaza was identified solely with Hamas, and therefore as hostile and alien. The growing inapplicability of occupation as an analytical and legal framework introduced a fourth paradigm shift regarding Israeli policy towards Palestinians and their territories. In the West Bank, this shift in Israeli policy is away from occupation towards continued colonization and annexation of Palestinian land. In Gaza, this shift in Israeli policy moved from one that sought to control and dominate the Palestinian economy, shaping it to Israel's own interests, to one that undermines and devastates the economy through the imposition of a blockade, which is really an intensified military closure, among other damaging measures designed to ensure the separation of the territories, thus preventing, again, the emergence of a Palestinian state. It should be said that some form of closure has been in effect in Gaza since January of 1991, before suicide bombings, before Hamas rockets, and before blockades. And this closure was formalized in 1993. The closure on Gaza has never been lifted. What has been subject to change is the intensity of the closure. And today, with the blockade, we see the closure in its most extreme form. Perhaps most striking of all, the ruination of Gaza's economy has transformed Palestinians from a people with national, political, and economic rights into a weakened community dependent on humanitarian assistance, for whom the international community is wholly responsible. It is no longer, and in fact has not been for quite some time, a question of economic growth, change, or reform, freedom, or sovereignty, but of essential humanitarian needs, of reducing the needs and rights of over 2 million people in Gaza to sacks of flour, rice, and sugar. Is it correct to say, therefore, that humanitarianism has become an instrument of the military? The deliberate reduction of Palestinians to a humanitarian issue deprived of political and economic rights and dependent on the international community for sustenance positions relief, not progress, as a primary, if not the only, political option for Gaza. As such, humanitarianism has come to define the way the international community interacts with Palestinians in Gaza, who are made irrelevant as political and national actors, in effect, invalidated. In this way, Israel and the West maintain a humanitarian problem to manage a political one. In this case, subduing an undesirable and inconvenient population where the goal is not to elevate people to a specific humanitarian standard, but to push them and keep them below that standard. In this way, humanitarian aid is used not only to meet the rapidly expanding needs of an increasingly impoverished population, but it is also used to prolong conflict and suffering. If a policy exists, it is one of not finding solutions. The resulting context has proved increasingly resistant to testimony, evidence, and fact, assigning little, if any, value to them. As I've lectured elsewhere, over time, the occupation has deepened and assumed a particularly destructive quality. In Gaza, the occupation is meant to prevent any kind of normal environment from emerging, institutionalizing in both practical and psychological terms a form of impairment that resists change the longer it is allowed to last and take shape. This abnormality is rooted fundamentally in cutting Gaza's ties to the outside world. Young people, the majority of Gaza's population, have no conception of the world beyond Gaza. They do not know what it means to board a plane, to board a train, to board a ship. Hence, economic collapse in the absence of rights has not only necessitated humanitarian intervention, but has placed Gaza in a context where the threat of catastrophe has effectively become a form of governance and suffering a legitimate instrument of control. As a colleague put it, quote, Israel governs by how near to the disaster threshold Gaza is allowed to go, end quote. Israel's objective in Gaza, therefore, is limited and contained to avert any large-scale disaster, such as starvation, which is a new and terrible metric. The need is to prevent catastrophe without removing its cause, transforming ordinary life into the continuation of war. Within this mode of rule, Palestinians are regarded as terrorists or charity cases, where relief assistance is now treated as a salary. In this regard, some local economists have told me that Gaza is in a state of post-collapse, and by this they mean Gaza has been removed from the sphere of politics and rational economics. One must ask how division and separation are embodied in the Palestinian experience and in the Israeli one. So now, having articulated a framework based on these few paradigm shifts, I'd like to turn to some of the prominent themes in my research. The first theme is what I call the nature of violence and the quotidian acceptance of destruction. What constitutes violence in the Palestinian context? The pressures on Gaza's population are well known. They are immense and unrelenting and include high levels of employment, impoverishment, considerable infrastructural damage and destruction, and environmental degradation, the latter a problem that remains dangerously underestimated and unaddressed. Hence, violence in Gaza, not only or even primarily, is defined in militaristic terms, but in everyday acts, not having enough water, not having enough electricity, the struggle to find a job, the struggle to access good medical care. It's even dangerous for children sometimes to play in a park or even burying a loved one. And within this construct, should humanitarianism be considered a form of violence, or at the very least, a double-edged sword? Is it ethical to keep people alive through subventions when they are being impoverished and killed? By operating in an environment where the emergency is not temporary, but permanent, and through the aid provided by the humanitarian community, which is clearly needed, the occupier is able to continue oppression. Today, Gaza finds itself in an anomalous and precarious place, deprived of the ordinary and comprehensible, an imposed reality now considered unremarkable and quite reasonable. After 55 years of occupation, 31 years of closure, 16 years of blockade, and 4 major assaults waged against it in 14 years, Palestinians in Gaza see little, if any, horizon or future beyond the panorama of destruction and ruination that now confronts them. And to this one must add the following: an electric fence built around Gaza in 1994, the bombing of Gaza's airport in 2001, the barring of Gazan students from West Bank universities since 2000, the banning of Gaza residents living in the West Bank since 2003, and the construction in 2021 of a 6-meter tall iron wall equipped with cameras, radar sensors, and remote-controlled weapon systems that also extends underground and into the sea, which I might add was celebrated by Israeli officials at the time of its completion. Furthermore, for at least 16 years since the blockade was imposed, Israel has argued that the blockade was necessary as a punitive measure designed to topple the Hamas regime and penalize the population for electing Hamas. Hence, creating economic hardship for ordinary Palestinians in Gaza was necessary to pressure Hamas to change its behavior. Now, the Israeli military is arguing something completely different, that creating greater economic opportunities for Gazans, including work inside Israel, will act as a form of pressure on Hamas not to take actions that would lead Israel to retaliate against the Palestinian population, thereby sacrificing whatever gains they acquired. Hence, such work permits are meant as bargaining chips that can be revoked at any time. To my knowledge, this 180-degree reversal has seldom been acknowledged by analysts, perhaps because it reflects a kind of provisional survival, to borrow from Judith Butler, to which we have become inured, and which is not designed to help Palestinians who are considered disposable, but rather to affirm their unworthiness and deepen control over them through a renewed, albeit limited, integrative dynamic. It also underlines the fact that Gaza's small and devastated economy deeply depends on access to external markets for employment and trade, which remains largely denied. The destruction that ensues at the individual or societal level, destruction in the absence of political life and structure, is deemed necessary and justifiable by Israel and the West. In this way, Butler argues, quote, Palestinians are deprived of life before they are killed, transformed into inert matter or destructive instrumentalities. To kill such a person, indeed such a population, thus calls upon a racism that differentiates in advance who will count as alive and who will not. Under such conditions, it becomes possible to think that ending life in the name of defending life is possible, even righteous, end quote. Hence, Gaza is a place where civilians do not exist. Lacking identity, personality, or power, they are in effect faceless. For too many, there are no parents in Gaza, there are no children, or sisters or brothers. There are no deaths to mourn. Rather, Gaza is where the grass grows wild and must be mowed from time to time, as some Israeli officials have stated. Of course, Palestinians reject their objectification and instrumentalization, but remain largely powerless against it. And this leads to my next theme. The failure by Israel and the West to connect Palestinian actions, both violent and nonviolent, with underlying conditions of impoverishment and desperation. This failure, born of political interest and racism, views Palestinians as something apart, illegitimate non-subjects, to borrow from Professor Nader Kevorkian, unable to approximate the other as us, as Judith Butler would say. This failure to connect Gaza's deteriorating economic conditions with Palestinian actions, including military escalation, has been consistent throughout my experience, even during major assaults on Gaza. As far as Israel and the West are concerned, the blockade is now an accepted, if not largely unquestioned and institutionalized part of the occupation in Gaza. This, despite the fact that the 16-year blockade, a form of collective punishment and a clear violation of international humanitarian law, has proved to be one of the most destructive measures imposed on society and economy, leading to various forms of protest, both violent and nonviolent. Referring to the damage inflicted during the May 2021 hostilities, the Middle East director of the International Committee of the Red Cross stated, quote, "The damage inflicted in less than 2 weeks will take years, if not decades, to rebuild," end quote. Rather, social and political problems, which arise from poverty, discrimination, and restriction, are described in terms of culture, religion, or nationalism, and are treated as terrorism. Thus, Palestinians have come to be viewed as a provocation to the state, who need to be managed and undone, reducing Palestinians to an exception and ensuring that they are seen that way. The next theme I recall, where the present, though severely diminished, is still better than the future. Perhaps one of the saddest changes I have witnessed over the last 2 decades in particular is the belief that the future will only bring greater suffering than the present. The contrast with the First Intifada and the tremendous energy that characterized that time is striking. Then people truly believed that a better future was not only possible, but attainable, and organized around that belief. Today, as one friend in his 20s recently told me, quote, "It is a crime to think about things improving. It is a crime even to think about things staying the same," unquote. So diminished, people live their lives with whatever they have, according to deprivation and scarcity. Having enough food, water, or electricity has been elevated to an aspiration. Many of my friends organize their day according to when they have electricity. There is no interest or energy to think about much else, let alone larger political or national issues. Another colleague, a highly educated woman and mother of 2 young children, told me that no one thinks about Jerusalem or the right of return anymore. What we think about is finding a job, job security, and feeding our children. The craving is not for a homeland, and the fear is not its absence. The craving is for a livelihood, clean water, and sanctuary. And the fear is that they are unattainable. According to a recent report by the International Committee of the Red Cross, 43% of young people in Gaza believe they have no hope of finding a job in the next 15 years. I would also point out that by the year 2050, less than 30 years from now, the population of the Gaza Strip is expected to double to 4.7 million people. This translates into approximately 34,000 people per square mile, living in a tiny area of depleted resources. What will Israel do then? The constriction of life and the individual and collective accommodation to it have been accompanied by detachment from politics and an absence of demands beyond those that are immediate, narrow, and basic to survival. In this regard, another young friend recently told me, quote, "My friends and I ask ourselves, do we know what we are passionate about? What is passion when you are in survival mode? There are no solutions, so we just talk. Do you know what it means when you cannot imagine life outside Gaza? We live with what we are given," end quote. Palestinians in Gaza emphasize their existence, but it no longer seems connected to a larger context of national liberation or a national project, as it once was, despite their strong identification as Palestinians and their strong connection to the land. I should add that this weakening connection to a political movement is expressed in rising levels of emigration, which is in its own way an attempt to create and embrace a future of sorts. The dream is to leave Gaza, many have told me. The director of a local human rights organization put it this way. He said this, referring to emigration, "This is a new, smarter Nakba. It's slow, but it's very much in progress. How did Palestinians get pushed to the point where its youth are willing to pay to leave? The whole point of our struggle used to be about coming back," end quote. Isra Jamal, a refugee and mother of 5 children, writes about the pain of seeing her family members leave Gaza. And I'm quoting her here. "Gaza is unlike anywhere else in the world. When someone leaves Gaza to fulfill their future, it's impossible to think about coming back. Most of the ambitious youths living here believe they have no future in Gaza, where problems have become increasingly complicated and almost impossible to solve," end quote. And then in talking about her own family members leaving, she says, "It wasn't easy for me to accept and adjust to their absence. I cried for a long time when I was alone without letting others notice," end quote. And of course, some of those leaving Gaza never reach their destination. Well, next theme, I call the permeation of loss and the waning of deterrence. Simply put, many, if not most, Palestinians in Gaza have reached a point, in fact, I believe it was reached some time ago, where they feel they have little, if anything, left to lose. This sense is not so much measured materially as it is psychologically, where more destruction does not inflict appreciably more pain. This sense of loss was particularly pronounced following the devastating summer 2014 assault. My last trip to Gaza was in the fall of 2016, and my observations from that trip were published in an article in the London Review of Books, where I asked, quote, "What more can Israel inflict when the loss of entire families is a daily topic of conversation?" End quote. Hence, new costs need to be created, such as jobs inside Israel. And as one Israeli analyst put it, it is the sense of having nothing left to lose that is also true of Hamas, where continued material losses have reached a point of saturation with little, if any, extra pain. In this context, Israel's deterrence policy, he argues, carries little, if any, weight, which strengthens Hamas's strategic position. I would also add here that although many Palestinians in Gaza criticize, if not condemn, Hamas's governance and ideology, there has been and continues to be support for its central role in the resistance. What is most concerning, in my view, is that even with the infusion of aid or increased levels of economic assistance to Gaza, what some donors erroneously call development assistance, little will change in the continued presence of the blockade and the occupation. In this regard, when donors speak of restoring Gaza to a state of pre-conflict, and that is their term, they reveal a fundamental, if not cynical, misunderstanding of life in Gaza and always have. Gaza has never truly enjoyed a state without conflict or violence broadly defined. Gaza exists in a state of perpetual conflict, where quiet is not the absence of conflict, nor is it peace. Defining it as such, as the international community often does, introduces yet another distortion into Gaza's lived reality. This will be my last theme, excuse me. which I call Othering Palestinians, Dehumanization, and Erasure. If there is one theme threaded through all my experiences in Palestine, excuse me, a theme that is the strongest and most consistent and unrelenting, it is the dehumanization of Palestinians and their continuous struggle against it. This dehumanization also speaks to a form of erasure that goes beyond physical annihilation. Butler captured this when she asks, when is life worthy of protection from destruction? When is life grievable? She writes, quote, war is in the business of producing and reproducing precarity, sustaining populations on the edge of death, sometimes killing its members and sometimes not. Either way, it produces precarity as the norm of everyday life. Palestinian life is either no life, a shadow life, or a threat to life as we know it. The latter presents an infinite threat against which a limitless defense formulates itself, end quote. War depends upon the differential distribution of grievability. Hence, Butler argues, quote, ungrievable lives are those that cannot be lost and cannot be destroyed because they inhabit a lost and destroyed zone. They are from the very start already lost and destroyed, which means that when they are destroyed in war, nothing is destroyed. The rationale for the destruction is that they do not count at all. I'd like to read an excerpt from my book, Unsilencing Gaza. I devote 2 chapters of the book to looking back at Gaza in the very early days of my research. What follows is based on field notes I kept during the first Intifada in 1988 through 1989, when my husband and I lived there during this period. In this excerpt, I described acts of humiliation by the Israeli army, which in the eyes of the soldiers seemed to describe not only lives that cannot be mourned, but also lives that do not contain any purpose, function, or claim that can be recognized as human. These acts were typically involved beating and otherwise humiliating women and children, especially in public and private spaces. And while I cannot say this was an official policy of the IDF, I can say it was a pattern of behavior that, while aberrant, was purposeful, and it recurred throughout my time in Gaza during that year. The most disturbing aspect of these beatings was a tacit understanding the soldiers had managed to impose on the population. And that understanding was, we will stop beating your women and children if you beat them. I do not know how this understanding was formed. All I know is that Palestinians responded in a way that was meant to mitigate harm and eliminate the possibility of greater violence. And here I quote from my field notes. Teachers told me stories of how soldiers would enter classrooms and begin hitting some of the children. Knowing that the only way to get rid of the soldiers was to take over, teachers would start slapping the children until the soldiers would leave. They would then comfort the children and try to distract them with play. A friend of mine, who at the time was a foreign diplomat and working for UNRWA as a refugee affairs officer, told me she saw soldiers dragging a 15-year-old girl up some stairs before beating her. The Palestinian driver of her car went over to the girl and started to hit her, at which point the soldiers left. Why do you think this is happening? I said. It is so horrible. She answered, to perpetuate a cycle of violence within Palestinian society, thereby breaking the bonds that hold families and society together, something Palestinians seem to understand and resisted. These beatings, of course, were also intended to humiliate and demean men, all men, not just those related to the woman or child being attacked, but those witnessing the assault and powerless to defend against it. The beatings were designed to instill submission more than fear, and for a time they failed to do so, which is why they recurred. Today, the situation is far worse, but the goal, as I've come to understand it, remains unchanged: to make Palestinians believe in their own insignificance and make others believe in it as well. In this regard, my friends also argue that the question of who counts, that in their view Palestinians do not count as human beings, is not the only question that must be asked. The other question is, how do they count? For many of my friends in Gaza, Palestinians matter, they say, Palestinians matter only as subjects on which new military technologies are tested and sold. This is a common belief in Gaza, as is the sense of abandonment, that no one, including their own leadership, both Fatah and Hamas, is accountable for or cares about Palestinian suffering. Palestinians in Gaza truly believe they are on their own. Some concluding thoughts. I call this two sides of the same Palestinian coin, exclusion and inclusion. Is Gaza a template for a new politics of exclusion that can be found in other contexts? And here I borrow from a recent essay I co-authored with a colleague in France, Professor Ivar Eklund. We write, quote, Gaza, of course, is an extreme case, but there are similar situations developing around the world, other places of inattention. In the US, for example, making America great again still goes hand in hand with sending people back to where they came from, where they will remain unseen. Similarly, millions are kept in refugee camps in Turkey, Libya, and in Europe itself, with very little prospect of leaving or earning a living. Families are kept for years in camps, caught between the hope of an improbable asylum in Europe and the fear of being sent back. They are increasingly seen as a nuisance to be contained and isolated rather than welcomed and integrated. They are the European versions of Gaza without the bombing. Many Gazas are developing around the world, from Gaza to Lesbos, from Lesbos to Afghanistan and beyond. Sites of exception are growing where people are barred from legitimate political discourse, unrecognized but kept alive, without claim or community or nationhood, where the principal aim of politics is to control an unwanted population with no vision of anything but further control. Will the West Bank be carved into mini Gazas? There is growing concern among Palestinians that Israel will respond to escalating tensions in the West Bank, such as Nablus, Jenin, and Shuafat, with the same methods of collective punishment and siege used in Gaza, what is now referred to as the Gazification of the West Bank. Yet, alongside this grim reality, there is another side that is seemingly contradictory but equally true. In a recent webinar, Professor Leila Farsakh, who's a colleague and friend of mine, argued that for the past 30 years, Israel has tried to fragment and kill the Palestinian question, but failed because it fundamentally is tied to people seeking dignity and freedom. She further argued that the Palestinian national and state project have, in their own way, fulfilled their mission, and that is to assert that Palestinians exist as a people and have a right to self-determination, which is no longer questioned for the most part, having entered the global, largely Western discussion. Palestinians now face a new reality, and that is one state. With the demise of the two-state solution, an historical compromise, which is a negotiated end to the conflict that would lead to a comprehensive peace, is no longer possible. According to Professor Farsakh, the question therefore becomes, how do Palestinians reclaim their right to self-determination in a one-state reality, which he argues has created a new space for national dialogue among Palestinians, despite a very egregious and adverse context where only a minority of Jewish Israelis support the idea of equal rights for Arabs and Jews? And what is Gaza's place in a one-state reality? How is Gaza to be reintegrated into that reality? In another webinar I attended not too long ago, one speaker asked the question, what is Palestine? A place, a country, a site of desire, a site of return, or an idea? He argued that the Palestinian struggle has been globalized via the internet and incorporated into other struggles like Black Lives Matter. The global feeling for Palestine, for what Palestine stands for, and for what it means to be a Palestinian, speaks to the idea of Palestine as a struggle against injustice and for justice, as defiance and steadfastness. In this way, the idea of Palestine, like that of Black Lives Matter, means something, as it speaks to power, but in a larger but in larger conceptual terms, such as equality or freedom. In my long engagement with Israel-Palestine, I've seen a great deal of change, much of it negative, but some of it positive. I very much agree that Palestine has come to stand for an idea and not just a place, and I believe this will continue to grow with Gaza at its center. What also has changed for the better, and dramatically so, in the US especially, is the expanding space for a counter-narrative, for asking different kinds of questions and for understanding Palestinians and Israelis outside the binary straitjackets in which they have often been placed. Some of the most dramatic changes have taken place in the progressive Jewish community in the United States, which is focused on ending the occupation, Palestinian liberation, and protecting Palestinian human rights. There are even unprecedented changes in the US Congress, where dozens of representatives now support legislation to stop Israel's demolition of Palestinian homes and detention of Palestinian children. Even though their numbers are small, this would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. We also have a Palestinian member of Congress. In the long run, these changes can only benefit both peoples. And as I have also seen, there are fewer forms of counterattack, although the attacks continue. However, I will say, of course, formidable constraints remain both in the US and Israel, particularly after the recent elections, and within the Palestinian political sector as well. In my ongoing discussions with friends and colleagues in Palestine and Israel, it has become increasingly clear that for more and more Palestinians, it is not Jewish sovereignty that they object to, but Jewish supremacy. And this leads to my last point. The situation in Palestine is tragic, yet important and potentially transformative changes are taking place at the popular level, fueled by a belief that freedom and the individual and political rights that attend it are more important than a state. Through this discursive shift from the state to the content of the state, from national rights to human rights, Palestinians are resisting and redefining the meaning of self-determination, which Professor Farsakh argues refers to the right of Palestinians to a political existence and to exert political rights alongside Israelis. Despite the immense pressures imposed on its society, Gaza also resists, and this resistance is expressed most powerfully, perhaps, in a flourishing of cultural production: film, art, poetry, literature, photography, and dance that is vibrant, creative, intellectually defiant, challenging in its own way the political status quo. But of course, this is not enough. There is a desperate need to think about new ways forward that must embrace Palestinian agency, correct the failures of the past, particularly as it regards the policies of the international community, and engage with Israelis who support the Palestinian struggle. Ultimately, the future of Palestinians and Israelis, the future that Palestinians and Israelis will share, must emanate from a sense of belonging to the world equally. And as Hannah Arendt argued, from, quote, a capacity to live with others precisely when there is no obvious mode of belonging, end quote. And as Judith Butler insists, we are all implicated in a shared world. Thank you.
So I'm sure you would all want to join me in thanking Sara for an absolutely fascinating talk tonight. She gave us, I think, an absolutely compelling, insightful, challenging, and indeed moving expose of her years of personal research in Gaza. I think it's very easy, isn't it? We read about Gaza and other parts of the world where life is difficult, and we hear about it on the news, read about it in the newspapers, but sometimes it can be quite easy to feel quite distant from it. And I think you've very powerfully brought the reality of what's happened in Gaza over the last decades and the reality of the lives of the people who live there to our attention tonight. And I really do want to thank you for that, Sara. I found that incredibly thought-provoking and, as I say, challenging in all sorts of ways. And I have to say, as a film historian myself, and who tends to seize upon images, that image of the elderly man throwing his oranges into the sea, which you started your talk with, will stay with me, I think, as a really powerful metaphor for the loss and the grief that you've been describing to us. So thank you so much for joining us tonight for such a wonderful talk, and I'm sure you'd all like to join me again in thanking Sarah for her talk. Thank you.